Princeton. Before coming to Brown in 2007, he served as curator of photography at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and he was director of the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona. Among his publications are several major exhibition catalogs and the major exhibitions that go with them, including Snapshots, The Photography of Everyday Life from 1998, Carlton Watkins, The Art of Perception, 1999, and Dreaming in Pictures, The Photography of Lewis Carroll in 2002. His book, Francis Frith in Egypt and Palestine, A Victorian Photographer Abroad, which is based on his dissertation, was awarded the Historians of British Art Book Prize in 2004. And he's contributed chapters and essays to books and exhibition catalogs too numerous to mention. It's a long list. But I will mention a few of the more recent works. At the moment, Professor Nicol has in press a chapter on the social history of photography for an English publication titled The Photography Studies Reader. And he's finishing up a long essay on the Walker Evans exhibition, American Photographs, accounting for its appearance at the Museum of Modern Art in 1938. He also has in progress book projects on photography and reception theory, on Roland Barthes, and one on UFO photos in the 50s and 60s. I think it probably tells us a lot about the 50s and 60s. That was the high water mark for UFO photos, some kind of combination of Cold War paranoia and hallucinogenic drugs. Anyway, his talk tonight, as you see, is Indeterminacy in the Photograph. So without further ado, Douglas Nicol.
Well, thank you, Michael and Ian, for having me here. Perhaps I should start with a bit of background on what this talk is and where it came from. A couple of years ago, I was at a College Art Association annual meeting, and I was having coffee with my Rutgers colleague, Andre Zervigon, who mentioned that he and another one of our colleagues, Sabine Friebel, were putting together an anthology of essays, a book to be called Photography and Doubt. And did I have anything I might contribute to it? From their title, I didn't think I did, but I mentioned that I had recently taught a graduate seminar on the topic of photography and philosophy, and that many of our readings there dealt with questions of belief, specifically why it is that we believe certain things about the lens-based photograph because of what the photograph does and doesn't show, and how it appears to stand in relation to the subject it depicts. He said that sounded good, and could I get to work? So I did last spring, eventually coming up with a piece that identifies what seemed to me to be some features or aspects of the conventional photograph that engendered a sense of indeterminacy about what we see in it, which is to say, it was an essay that tried to put two kinds of belief about photography, faith and doubt, in relation. It was for me a peculiar project, doubly peculiar because I have no more than the average art historian's grasp of the Western philosophical tradition. Yet when the essay got turned in, I felt like I had only begun to address the difficulty, the problems that I had outlined there, and that addressing them further might likely bring new problems to light. So when I was invited to speak here under the umbrella of your visual studies program, I thought maybe I'd find an informed or at least tolerant audience willing to consider the matter and brainstorm the topic a bit further. So clearly I'm going to qualify this whole affair up front. The ideas are at best still half-baked and still baking, and the kinds of examples I'm going to ask you to consider are not necessarily historical in character, but more heuristic and indebted to aesthetics and psychology. We might begin by framing the problem in what I take to be the stakes of the problem. From the moment of its advent in the late 1830s, the photograph has been theorized. Indeed, we might acknowledge that every description is a theorization in the particular ways it asks us to consider the thing being described and in what it neglects to propose for consideration. Francois Arago's public announcement to the French Academies of Arts and Science in 1839 of Daguerre's discovery unleashed in the popular press a torrent of figurative language, reflecting what turned out to be a collective effort to characterize a process that was both like and unlike other kinds of visual representation. Thus, aware that the new process could not record color, Arago compares its monochrome renderings to those of a mezzotint. We see this in the daguerreotype of Daguerre here on the left. But then leaves the realm of the familiar to portray the invention as nothing less than nature reflecting its own face. This trope, that of the generation of pictures by a process that was not just mechanical, but automatic, became ubiquitous. A Philadelphia newspaper reported on self-operating processes of fine art in March of 1839, and speculated that the discovery will prove as valuable to art as the power loom and steam engine was to manufacturing, and the drill and the plow was to agriculture. The English inventor of photography, William Henry Fox Talbot, adopted a similar strategy. He called his process photogenic drawing, in clear analogy to the familiar products of the draftsman's pencil, but in his first public description of it, contends that his invention differs from any previous contrivance because, as he puts it, it is not the artist who makes the picture, but the picture which makes itself. All that the artist does is dispose the apparatus before the object whose image he requires. He then leaves it for a certain time, greater or less, according to circumstances. At the end of the time, he returns, takes out his picture, and finds it finished. Talbot displayed his first trials at the Royal Institution in London in January of 1839, including one image of his home in Wiltshire, Laycock Abbey, and reported, quote, "I believe it to be the first instance on record of a house having painted its own portrait." And then concludes, "A person unacquainted with the process, if told nothing of all this was executed by the hand, must imagine that one has at one's call the genius of Aladdin's lamp. You make the powers of nature work for you, and no wonder that your work is well and quickly done." This pencil of nature, as he was soon to dub it, was both an invention, the result of human ingenuity, and a scientific discovery, found by observing phenomena residing in the natural world. There is thus an impulse in these earliest descriptions to establish the photograph as something simultaneously the same and different from traditional arts. It is a visual representation, usually a picture, so it is like a drawing, print, or painting in that regard, but the specific way it's known to be produced, with chemistry and some method of mechanical registration of an image composed with light, makes it quite unlike and distinctive from conventional mediums. That ostensibly mechanical nature was quickly moralized. The photograph was deemed superior to the handmade image in its accuracy and repeatability, epistemic virtues for those who value objectivity and industrialization. Or it was deemed inferior and a threat if you value imagination over literal naturalism in art, or worry about the consequences of labor-saving technologies for industries that depend on skill of the human hand. Curiously, this formative impulse to get at photography's true character or essence has never ceased. Throughout its history, find attempts to describe once and for all what photography is. The impulse witnessed a new fluorescence in the 1970s and 80s, at just the moment when photographic history and theory first entered the Academy in a conspicuous way. Now, the effort to distinguish photography's uniqueness could make use of concepts from the concurrent interest in linguistics and semiotics. The terms were set by the film theorist Henri Bazin, whose early essay titled "The Ontology of the Photographic Image" argues that what makes the photograph special is its objectivity, a feature derived from the fact that, quote, "between the originating object and its reproduction, there intervenes only the instrumentality of a non-living agent, the camera." For the first time in history, an image of the world is formed automatically, he says, without the creative intervention of man. By the late 1970s, the art historian Rosalind Krauss would argue that the mainstream of abstract contemporary art was founded, paradoxically, on the logic of the photograph, specifically its semiotic status as a message without a code, citing a formulation from the French theorist Roland Barthes. The natural world impresses itself directly on the photographic emulsion, she notes, and this quality of transfer or trace by means of light gives the photograph its undeniable veracity. She invokes the late 19th century American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce and describes the photograph as an index, a variety of sign type that works through pointing to a direct causal connection between the sign and that which generates it. A footprint in the sand is an index, for instance, in the way it points to the tangible foot that produced it, and differs from a drawing of a foot in that there is a point-to-point physical correspondence between the imprint and the foot. Peirce would say the footprint is really affected by the foot, where the drawing is not affected by it. Following Peirce, Krauss wants to see the photograph as another such indexical trace. Barthes adds to this understanding the phenomenological aspect of temporality. The photograph shows something that we know existentially to have happened in the past. It's having been there, but does so in an image that presents a perpetual here and now, an imagistic presence that denoted an actual physical absence. On the right, by the way, lower right, is the adult Roland Barthes, and above him, a snapshot of him as a child with his mother, who had recently died when he published his last book, Camera Lucida, in 1980. So it's a book all about presence and absence. For the study of photography, this inaugurated what we might call the index problem. For more than 30 years, scholars have invoked the idea of the photograph as an index to argue for its special nature and for a kind of museum specificity, founded upon its mechanical and automatic way of generating images. The photograph became a key theoretical object for postmodernism, not only because of its ubiquity in modern visual culture, but because it derived an especially pernicious rhetorical authority from its condition as a document or uncoded message, and its ability to create simulacra of the world, a condition that many felt needed to be unmasked. I'm being highly schematic here, of course, out of necessity. We could spend several hours debating the index problem and what Roland Barthes' meditations have bequeathed us. But that very exercise was carried out by James Elkins in 2007 as part of a series of art seminars. It was a gruesome spectacle in many ways, as the experts participating in it fought over entrenched thinking about the index and the punctum, and respondents, including Rosalind Krauss and Joel Snyder, offered assessments that ended essentially in a stalemate. In his contribution, our own Michael Leja was struck by the vehemence of the quarrel and notes how Peirce's system, which is actually quite nuanced and complicated, is so often used in sloppy, formulaic, and inappropriate ways in writing about photography. Well-chosen words. I share this consternation. However, I don't think this is simply a matter of getting Peirce right, although that would be a very good place to start. I believe that the primary intellectual weakness to photographic theory from Bazin forward is its overdependence on the issue of generation or production of the photograph. To identify photography as essentially indexical or mechanical or automatic is to posit a kind of determinacy to its products that is removed from human agency. But why the overweening emphasis on production, we might ask, when we know that in any transaction involving representation, there are at least 3 integers involved in the semantic chain that produces meaning. Production cannot be considered without perception. Makers of images often have viewers as their intended recipients, even if they are only hypothetical viewers, or themselves as viewers. and viewers can never escape some notion of a maker, the tacit entity that occasioned their viewing. I believe that ontological projects to understand the photograph fall short if the photographic viewer is left out of consideration. The photograph has a target who is acted upon in perceptual and psychological ways. Authority, temporality, faith, and doubt are conditions of our minds, not qualities that inhere in pictures. And so, photographic theory remains impoverished by a lack of attention to the particular mental acts the photograph catalyzes, what Ernst Gombrich once called the beholder's share. Seen in this light, we realize that calling the photograph an index, or stressing its special mimetic nature, is not an innocent description of a technology, but the expression of a wish or a desire. To appreciate the role of viewership to the questions at hand, we might begin with a thought experiment. Imagine that in my studio, I hang a sizable sheet of spotlessly clean, white, seamless background paper. And I then set my large format film camera on a tripod directly before it. I focus it properly on the plane of the paper on the wall and arrange it so the ground glass is filled beyond its edges with the paper's blank surface. I expose the film correctly, process it the standard way in my darkroom, and then I make a print of this negative. Again, exposed and processed in the normal way, and I hang the result before you. While in the darkroom, however, I've taken the opportunity to put a second sheet of the same photographic paper in the fixer and rinse pads. When dry, I hang the second sheet next to the first, and I ask you to describe what you see. Two identical sheets of blank photographic paper, you might answer. No, I point out, the sheet on the left is actually a photograph of something to be found in my studio, a piece of seamless background paper, generated exactly the way any other conventional black and white photograph would be. When you look again, the print on the left might now seem different. It depicts a close-up view of the unmarked surface of the paper residing in my studio at a specific past moment. The appearance of the background paper as it would have looked to you if you stood right up next to it under my studio lights at that instant. Perhaps I then realized I'd gotten confused. What I meant was the sheet on the right is a conventional photograph, and the sheet on the left is just unexposed paper. You look again, and now it's the print on the right that documents my sheet of blank paper. The one on the right bears a referential, indexical, optical, and time-based relationship to a real-world photographic referent. Under most definitions, it would be difficult to find a basis for denying that it is anything less than a perfect analogon of its featureless physical subject, at least so far as it is a product of standard photographic operations performed correctly to record that subject under those conditions. And we may well believe it looks like its subject, though whether it is an image of that subject is debatable. In this example, what has changed moment to moment is not the prints placed before you, but the kinds of assumptions you make about what you are seeing, specifically about how each print was fabricated. They are assumptions you brought to the experience, but that I prompted with my commentary. This background awareness plays a significant and normally unappreciated role in the way we perceive pictures of all kinds. The philosopher Richard Wollheim, following Husserl, describes the experience of seeing in. Stationed before a landscape painting, we apprehend its image, trees, skies, roads, and at the same time, we are aware that we are standing inside of a room examining a small flat panel, once coated by an artist with strokes of colored pigment. The painting is apprehended visually as an object. It shares our space and time, but what it represents is apprehended in the imagination and requires a certain suspension of awareness of the physicality of the flat thing we are viewing. We see in, beyond the physical aspect of a marked surface, when we apprehend a pictorial representation there, when we make out the appearance of spatial depth, for instance, or the play of light and shadow on its subjects, since the surface we are beholding has no appreciable physical depth of its own, and the light falling on it in the gallery is actually quite even.